Tighten the start pin!
At 23:45 on the night of October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched low behind the wheel of PT-48, his eyes fixed on the dark water ahead. 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges sliced through the black surface off Cape Esperance, their engines droning steadily as they moved south. Lynch was 26 years old. He had already completed 14 night patrols. He had not scored a single confirmed kill. Tonight looked no different, at least at first. The barges were not random targets. Each one carried soldiers and ammunition bound for Guadalcanal. 60 Japanese troops per barge, rifles, machine gun ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything the Japanese ground forces desperately needed. The barges were protected too. Mounted amidships on each vessel was a Type 92 heavy machine gun. Steel plate armor lined the hulls, thick enough to deflect rifle fire. These were not wooden fishing boats. These were armored supply ships built specifically to survive attack. Lynch looked down at his weapons. PT-48 carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes. Each torpedo weighed more than 2,000 pounds. Each carried a 466-pound TNT warhead. On paper, they were devastating weapons. In reality, they were useless against these targets. The Mark 8 torpedoes ran at a minimum depth of 10 feet. The Japanese barges drew barely 5 feet of water. The torpedoes would pass cleanly underneath them without touching a thing. By mid-October 1942, motor torpedo boat. Squadron 3 was bleeding boats in the waters around Guadalcanal. 6 PT boats had already been lost. 17 sailors were dead. The pattern repeated night after night. PT boats detected Japanese barge convoys. They made torpedo runs. The torpedoes missed. Japanese gunners opened fire. PT boats either limped away or burned. PT-48's twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns could fire 850 rounds per minute. Against wooden boats, they were lethal. Against armored Daihatsu barges, they were nearly useless. The 50 caliber rounds sparked harmlessly off the steel plating, doing little more than scratching paint. Meanwhile, Japanese forces continued running supplies down the narrow stretch of ocean Americans called the Slot. Under cover of darkness, destroyers and cruisers, known as the Tokyo Express, delivered men and material. When American aircraft made destroyer runs too dangerous, the Japanese adapted. They switched to barges, slower, smaller, harder to detect, immune to American torpedoes. At Tulagi, PT squadron commanders were desperate. Some crews tried mounting single-shot Army M3 37mm anti-tank guns on their bows. The wheels were removed. The guns were lashed to wooden planks. One shot. Manual reload. It was crude, slow, and barely survivable. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's PT-109 mounted one of these guns before a patrol in August. It fired once. Then the crew had to reload under machine gun fire. It was not a solution. It was a gamble. The problem was mathematical. One Daihatsu barge could carry 60 armed troops or 8 tons of supplies. The Japanese were running 20 to 30 barges per night past Guadalcanal. To disrupt the supply lines, PT boats needed to destroy multiple barges on every patrol. Single-shot weapons could not do that. 3 miles inland from Lunga Point sat Henderson Field. The Marines had captured it on August 7, 1942. By October it looked like a graveyard. Burned-out aircraft littered the runway. Bomb craters scarred the coral. Japanese Betty bombers and Zero fighters attacked almost daily. American pilots flew anything that could still get airborne. P-400 Airacobras, F-4F Wildcats, patched-together wrecks that barely held together on landing. Dozens of Bell P-39 Airacobras lay smashed around the field. Broken wings, crumpled fuselages, engines seized, but their noses, those were different. The Airacobra was an odd aircraft. Its engine sat behind the pilot. A long drive shaft ran under the cockpit to the propeller. That strange layout created empty space in the nose, and inside that space sat something extraordinary. A 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon. The cannon fired through the propeller hub. It could fire 150 rounds per minute. Each horseshoe-shaped magazine held 30 rounds. Muzzle velocity 2,000 feet per second. The rounds were designed to destroy light armor and aircraft. High explosive, armor-piercing, brutal firepower. If you wanted to kill armored barges, this was the weapon. Most of the wrecked P-39s at Henderson Field were total losses. Engines were ruined, wings were torn off, fuselages were cracked beyond repair, but the cannons were intact. Hydraulic recoil systems, feed mechanisms, barrels, everything needed to make them work. On the morning of October 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch walked Henderson Field at dawn. He counted 23 wrecked Airacobras. Some had been sitting there for weeks. Mechanics had stripped. Radios, instruments, control cables. Nobody had touched the cannons. They were aircraft weapons. No doctrine existed to mount them on boats. No approval had been given. No one had even tried. Lynch stopped beside a P-39 whose nose was buried in coral. The cannon protruded from the propeller hub like a steel finger. He ran the numbers in his head. 150 rounds per minute, 30-round magazine, automatic fire. He turned toward the water where PT-48 waited at the dock. 3 of his mechanics were watching him. They already knew. That afternoon at 14 Lynch walked into the office of Commander Alan Calvert, commanding officer of Squadron 3. There were no forms to fill out, no procurement channels, no paperwork. Just a direct request and a desperate situation. By 1630, 4 PT boat crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches. They had until nightfall. The M4 cannon weighed 213 pounds without ammunition. The hydraulic recoil system added 40 pounds. The feed mechanism added another 30. Total weight, roughly 280 pounds. PT-48 was an 80-foot Elco boat built of mahogany planking over oak frames. No one had ever calculated whether its deck could handle a 280-pound automatic cannon firing continuously. They were about to find out. Technical Sergeant James Coogan had maintained P-39s in Michigan before the war. By October 1942, he was an armorer at Henderson Field. He knew every bolt and hydraulic line in the M4 cannon. He was the first man Lynch's crew found. The first wreck they approached had taken a 20mm round through the cockpit weeks earlier. The pilot had died instantly. Nobody had moved the aircraft. Coogan crawled into the nose with a wrench and cutting torch. The cannon was bolted to the engine reduction gear housing with 8 high-tensile bolts. Each required a 15 to 16-inch socket. Coogan had a 3x4-inch socket. It would have to do. Hydraulic lines were disconnected. The charging cable removed. Electrical firing solenoids cut. Then the engine mount itself was cut away. It took 2 hours per aircraft. They had 6 hours of daylight. Nothing went smoothly. On the second aircraft, hydraulic fluid had congealed. Bolts were seized from tropical heat. There was no penetrating oil. They used aviation gasoline and waited. Slowly the bolts came free. By 1730, 3 complete cannons lay on the coral beside the runway. Coogan inspected them. One had a cracked recoil cylinder, unusable. One had a bent feed powel, repairable. One was pristine, one working cannon. That was enough. PT boats had no mounts for aircraft cannons. Lynch needed a pedestal that could absorb recoil, rotate, and survive wave impacts at 40 knots. Henderson Field's machine shop had 1 lathe, 1 drill press, and a welding rig powered by a diesel generator. Chief machinist's mate, Donald Frey, sketched a design in grease pencil on scrap aluminum. Simple, brutal, effective: a steel base plate, a vertical pipe, a rotating collar, a yoke to hold the cannon. All built from scrap landing gear, they started welding at 1815. The generator overheated repeatedly. Weld 5 minutes. Cool. Weld again. By 21, the mount was finished. Ugly, scorched, slightly wobbly, it would hold. They loaded the cannon onto a truck. Sailors held it steady on the rough road to the dock. A Higgins boat ferried it to Tulagi. Lynch was waiting. By so too, thus on October 21, 1942, PT-48 carried the first aircraft automatic cannon ever mounted on a U.S. Navy PT boat. It had never been fired. At 22 Baus, PT-48 left Tulagi. At 23:55, radar picked up 4 surface contacts. At 800 yards, the Japanese opened fire. At that moment, gunner's mate Harold Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The 37mm cannon roared. The deck flexed. The mount held. High explosive shells tore into the lead barge. The 4th round detonated inside the troop compartment. The fuel tank ignited. Men jumped into the water. 12 seconds later, the magazine was empty. Mitchell reloaded. The 2nd barge exploded. The 3rd was crippled. 90 rounds fired. 2 barges destroyed. 1 disabled. 0 American casualties. By dawn, every PT commander wanted the cannon. By October 23rd, 3 more boats were armed. By November, 8 boats carried salvaged cannons. Combat results spoke louder than doctrine. 14 barges destroyed in 8 patrols. 0 PT boats lost. The Bureau of Ordnance listened. On December 7, 1942, production was authorized, but the sailors couldn't wait. They kept building. New cannons arrived secretly from New Caledonia. Factory mounts followed. By January 1944, the 37mm cannon was standard. The M9 variant followed. Longer barrel, higher velocity, greater range. PT boats became gunboats. Barges vanished from Japanese supply routes. 800 Japanese vessels destroyed. Casualties reduced by 60%. An innovation born from wreckage changed naval warfare. Lieutenant Lynch survived the war. Coogan trained hundreds. Frey's crude mount became factory doctrine, and PT boats, once nearly obsolete, became some of the deadliest small craft of World War II, all because someone looked at a crashed airplane and asked, why not? The Japanese noticed the change before American headquarters did. On the night of October 25, 1942, radio intercept teams at Tulagi logged an unusual transmission. A barge commander reported encountering small enemy craft firing explosive shells. Another message followed minutes later. The phrase used was repeated twice for clarity. Aircraft cannon mounted on boats. For weeks, Japanese barge crews had operated with near impunity. PT boats were an annoyance, not a threat. Torpedoes missed. Machine gun fire bounced harmlessly off steel plating. Crews returned fire, forced the Americans away, and continued south with supplies intact. That pattern had held since August. Now it was broken. Japanese commanders initially believed the reports were exaggerated. Barges exploding violently suggested destroyer fire or aerial attack, not small patrol boats. But more reports came in. Entire convoys failing to arrive. Survivors pulled from the water describing rapid automatic fire followed by internal detonations. By the end of October, Japanese intelligence officers concluded something had changed. The Americans had found a way to kill barges. This realization forced immediate tactical adjustments. Barges began traveling farther offshore. Convoys reduced speed to minimize wake. Crews attempted to hide along jungle coastlines during daylight and run at night in scattered formations. None of it solved the problem. The 37mm cannon had turned PT boats from harassment craft into executioners.